I think you'll all agree with me that we had an incredibly insightful session earlier on, chaired by Shanta on redistribution, which I think has really inspired, some important discussions in the breakout groups. I think even the previous discussion and the comments from Mr. Coveney on multilateralism, from what I hear, have been, have created quite a bit of discussion in the multilateral breakout. An important point that was emerging from the breakout is actually the importance, once again, to really try and make multilateralism fit for purpose. I think there's a sense that there is a lot of reliance on global funds by bilateral donors, but perhaps at the expense of programmatic funds, which clearly calls for renewed efforts to reshape our multilateral system and make it really work. So I'm sure we'll reflect more on this in this last session on the new social contract, and I'm really delighted to navigate this session with a fantastic panel to hand over to the Director General of IRISH-AID, Rory De Burca, with renewed thanks to IRISH-AID for making today's possible. I think, as the Minister was saying this morning, ODI and IRISH-AID share the same determination and passion to address inequality both between and within countries, which is why we decided to jointly convene this conversation. Rory, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. I think everybody's in the afternoon at this stage, I hope. Running through the discussions today have been themes of inequality and how to build back from the pandemic, and in particular, how can we renew or regenerate that sense of social contract? I think we all have those questions at home, and I think there's a sense of a global social contract as well that flows through. And as Sarah mentioned, some of the elements have been explored in the previous sessions. The virus, has and is impacting on health, on education, and on income, on wealth. And there are big questions about, our redistributive mechanisms, whether it's through tax or social protection or the role of international organizations and order in that process. And so in this session, I think what we would like to do is take those discussions up a level and sort of ask ourselves some critical questions about what is or what might a new social contract or a new modus vivendi, at a global level, and particularly looking to less well-off countries look like. And I think that's going to raise some key issues around trust, relationships between state and citizen, or institutions and citizens, and institutions and the state, and some real interesting issues around the changing world of work as well, in addition to some of those issues around fiscal policy, redistributive methods within and between states, labour markets, public health, and the balances between capital and labour, and capital and governments that I think will have come up in some senses in the previous sessions. So to explore those questions, we have joined by a really good expert panel here today, who will really, I hope, help us dig into some of these issues. They are Baroness Minouche Shafik, who's the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. We have Sharon Burrow, who's the General Secretary at the International Trade Union Confederation. We have Phil Bloomer, who is the Executive Director at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and Dominic McVeigh, who's an entrepreneur, a business leader, and a member of the ODI Board of Trustees. So thank you, everyone, for agreeing to join us on this panel today. I'd like to make this, insofar as the technology allows, as interactive a session as possible. So we'd like to get some questions from you, the audience. So please use the chat box below the video stream to insert questions and comments, and we'll try and capture them and feed them back into the panel and use that to animate our discussion as it evolves. And also, please feel free to use the Twitter machine at ODIDev or at IRISH-AID, and hashtag global reset and hashtag equality. So, or inequality. Hopefully we'll get to hashtag equality very soon, but that might depend on the quality of our discussion today. And with that, and with no further ado, I'd like to begin the session. And I'm going to start up by moving to Baroness Shafik, to Minouche. And Minouche, your question to open it up is, from your experience, how has the pandemic exposed the frailty of our social contract or social contracts? And how can we harness the opportunity of these circumstances we're in to re-establish or strengthen that global contract? Manoush, over to you.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you very much. So this is a very hard question for me to answer because I've just written an entire book called What Do We Owe Each Other? A New Social Contract, which lays out why I think the social contract was broken before COVID, how COVID exacerbated it, and what a new social contract might look like for both advanced and developing countries, that provided a new social contract that provided a better architecture of both security and opportunity in our societies. But what I'll try and do very quickly is focus on some of the key elements for developing countries, given that this is ODI and that's our focus. And I think it's a very interesting moment for developing countries, both because COVID revealed where the vulnerabilities were greatest, and of course, who was hit hardest. It was women, the poor, the young, and the old. Those were the groups that COVID revealed to be the most vulnerable. But also, developing countries are in the middle of redefining their social contracts from one in which the social safety net was largely provided by families and communities to one in which the state and the market play a bigger role. And that process of developing a new safety net has had many elements. For first and foremost, providing a floor on people's incomes. And now ODI's own research has shown this. Probably about 120 developing countries have some element of cash transfer schemes, which provide an absolute minimum below which no one can go. And they worked rather well during COVID, especially when they could be adjusted when certain communities face severe shocks. So providing a floor on minimum incomes is key. We know how to do it. We have the technology and the infrastructure, and that needs to continue. Second is sort of equalizing opportunities across different groups. And I guess I'm a huge supporter of what we call pre-distribution interventions, interventions that increase opportunities from the start, which means that ex post redistribution of incomes is not necessary because people have good jobs and can support themselves from the beginning. And here I would put a huge emphasis on more investments in early years, because we know that social mobility can be enhanced most quickly before children get to school, pre-age 6 and pre-age 3 in many cases. And countries that have invested in those early years have seen massive improvements in income prospects later in life under very rigorous randomized controlled trials. And I would also argue that most developing countries have had huge success in getting enrollment into primary and secondary education, but underinvestment in what happens in people's adult education, tertiary, vocational, educational opportunities throughout life. So I would say a new social contract needs to invest more at the beginning of life and later in adult life. Another key element of a better social contract would allow women's economic potential to be fulfilled in a better way. We've now reached gender parity in most aspects of our educational systems. And actually today, more women graduate from university than men, including in the developing world. And yet women across the world are still doing 2 hours more of unpaid work than men. And that, to a large extent, explains the gender pay gap. So better provision of childcare and parental rights and parental leave rights would be a way to allow women to participate fully in the paid labor market to the extent they want to and on equal terms. Work, I'll just say one thing because we have Sharon Burrows here and I'm sure she'll talk much more eloquently than I will, but informality has been a key part of the current economy, and we've seen that workers who are in the informal sector and in precarious work have suffered the most. And we need to move to a world where benefits are paid to everyone, regardless of the nature of their employment contract. And I'm sure Sharon will say a bit more about that. Finally, old age and poverty in old age. I think most countries now have the ability to provide minimum pensions, minimum state pensions for all, paid for through general taxation to make sure that the old are not ever in a state of complete destitution. And I think those what I've described are elements of what a better social contract would look like, which would respond both to the challenges of COVID, but also the more long-term fundamental challenges in our societies.
Thank you, Manoush. I'm struck listening to you that actually many of those elements of the social contract, while you refer them to the developing world, are actually questions which have come up in the developed world through COVID as well for a renewed exposition. And I think, that hopefully that opens up a space for a different quality of conversation globally around these questions, more of interdependence and mirroring, but then a sort of a problematic that's over there somewhere or othered. But we might come back to some of that later on. Sharon, if I might move on to you, and maybe you've been teed up to a certain extent by Manoush, but International Trade Union Confederation represents 200 million workers in 163 countries and territories, effectively nearly every UN member state, with a number of exceptions. And from your experience, how have the COVID-19 response measures so far helped or hindered, indeed, the way in which we might address those cracks in the social contract? And I mean, maybe specifically with regard to treatment of workers. Over to you, Sharon.
So thank you, Rory. And Manoush, tick, 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 you've actually done it again. You've put the broad scope of why we need a new social contract and what we need on the table. So let me just address Rory's question and through the world of work lens, the need for a new social contract. Our model of hyperglobalization, circa 1980s plus, has left us, even before COVID, with massive historical inequality, as well as the climate emergency. And inequality was of income, with a total breakdown in the labour market. Manoush said about 60% informal, 40% formal, and a third of those actually in precarious work. And the new platform businesses are actually informal models. This is not a model of recovery or resilience. And then, of course, there's gender and race inequality. So what do we do about it? We need a new social contract, and COVID-19 took those practices and just exposed them as craters. We have almost, 300 million jobs lost in terms of the formal economy, 1.6 billion people in the informal economy, absolutely facing destitution on a daily basis. And only 55% of the world's people have some or adequate social protection. 75% have inadequate or no social protection in combination. That's not a basis of resilience or dignity, shared distribution. It's a scandal. And so we need to change the business model, but we need to change government's view of who they're accountable to and what they're accountable for. So if you look through the lens of the world of work, we need, first of all, to clean up that labour market. And the ILO declaration does that by outlining both a floor of social protection and a floor of labour rights protection, whether you're in informal or formal work. Fundamental rights, health and safety, a minimum wage in which you can live with dignity, and control over maximum hours of work. Now, it also lays out a recipe for a transformative agenda for women and just transition for climate and indeed technology. What we say is our judgment about a new social contract will be through this lens: jobs, jobs, and jobs. Investment in jobs, climate-friendly jobs, all investment will have to have a sustainability and a jobs lens. All central banks will have to take responsibility for mandates around employment and climate, not just an economy that grows wealthier without distribution. We need, in addition to that, of course, rights, and I've laid that out. We need social protection law, and we want a global fund of social protection for all workers. And given this is an ODI environment, can I tell you that the OECD stats show that only 0.4% of ODI funding goes to social protection? That's got to shift dramatically. And then we want equality, of course, and that means taking care of not just wages and distribution, but of course of the marginalised groups, bringing us to inclusion, which must be about the development model and the model of economy that indeed is available to include all people in full employment through the generations, and indeed a development model for excluded nations where the dominant model of trade, and is where multilateral reform is critical, has never had a flaw of fair competition with rights or environmental standards or other measures. This is serious work, and this is the year to deliver not the narrative now, but the content.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I mean, there's a lot there in terms of, I mean, each one of those words, like sustainability, rights, social protection, equality, within it, there's so much underneath each one of those. If we are to move on and change the model, and you mentioned a number of the actors that need to be engaged. Clearly, workers, governments, those who aren't working but would like to work, or are working outside of the normal boundaries of formal work as well, and the precarity of those situations, and in a sense, you know, these are issues which I think Phil engages with, and I'd be interested, Phil, you know, if you're seeing shifts when it comes to, you know, the various roles and responsibilities between state, companies, employers, and employees, particularly in this kind of COVID context, from which we might build moving forward.
Thanks very much, Rory. And we are seeing shifts, and some of those are positive, and I'll come to those in a moment. But firstly, just a few opening remarks. The social contract that we see around the world has been broken, as others have already said. And a major contributor has been those unfettered markets and the business model of the last 50 years that Sharon spoke to. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated those deep flaws which were already laid bare by the global economic crisis of 2008. And we are far now from that golden era of globalization. Instead, if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer that came out today, you can see that global markets are associated in the public mind with widening inequality, stagnant wages, precarious employment, rootless corporations, and climate breakdown. So our own work as the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre over the last year has really highlighted how many millions of workers in global supply chains have been left in destitution or close to it by the summary action of brands that have protected their shareholders at the expense of consideration of their suppliers, workers, and communities. I mean, we've taken up over 800 allegations of abuse in the past year and reported on many, many more. From women and migrant workers in the apparel factories of Phnom Penh or Dakar, Sao Paulo, Chihuahua, dismissed without their wages being paid or without severance pay, to meat packers in Mexico, USA, and Germany left unprotected and exposed to COVID-19, and gig workers around the world, across Asia, for instance, purposefully misclassified as self-employed and then summarily dismissed and left without jobs or sick pay. So the question is, how do we create that new social contract where shared trust and consent are engendered through a common understanding of fairness and justice? Well, one key aspect will be a systematic shift, we think, towards a new business model that puts primacy on shared prosperity, shared risk, and including across generations. I believe there are grounds for cautious optimism. Firstly, we've got clusters of responsible governments, businesses, and investors, as you said earlier, that now recognise that this model is broken and in urgent need of repair. The threat of authoritarian populism, exemplified by last week's events, unfortunately, in Washington, and the accelerating climate crisis is putting the fear of God in many who've remained pretty complacent over the last 20 years. And secondly, the pandemic, as we know, has led many governments to decide that this is the time for some transformation through a just recovery. So our collective challenge is, over the next 3 years, is to use that tragedy of the pandemic to press for those systemic changes. And as Paramita said at the beginning of this conference, it particularly changes in the last mile of the value chains, for instance, of companies where the poorest people are. So what would that be? Well, 3 key components we'd say would be, firstly, government and private investment in our economies for a just recovery. focused on society's greatest challenges, inequality in a digital world, tackled through strengthened labour rights, living wage, robust social protection, and tilting taxation from income to wealth to support health and education. And equally, of course, investment must drive towards that just transition to zero emissions. The second element would be the need for strict conditions on government assistance to business, the bailouts that we've seen. There should be no aid to those companies using tax havens. The Danish government has led the way on that. Time-bound targets for carbon emission reductions. The French government has done that to the car makers in their bailouts. And time-bound targets for human rights due diligence strategies throughout the supply chains of business. And of course, an end to fossil fuel subsidies. And then finally, governments must regain the confidence to enact smart regulation and business incentives. So, for instance, the European Union's human rights and environmental due diligence law will fundamentally change the calculus of risk in boardrooms in favour of human rights and climate action, again, tilting the level playing field towards the excluded and the vulnerable. It should be enacted across member states with both liability for companies and penalties when there is abuse. And all states should overhaul their public procurement procedures to reward responsible companies and exclude abuse. I mean, how can we, for instance, now continue to protect our essential workers with PPE rubber gloves that have been made by migrant workers toiling in conditions of debt bondage and forced labour across Malaysia, which is where they all come from? So these are, I believe, some feasible and essential shifts to build a new social contract, to build back the business's social license to operate in societies around the world, and secure shared prosperity and climate security for all. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Phil. I mean, there's a lot there again. And I suppose, just to pick out two things in a sense to tee up Dominic, but I mean, I was struck by that sense of changing how we define risk if we want to engage business, so that the incentives move, or maybe we price things that we don't price at the moment, to put different words on what you said. And I also, you talked about good business and responsible business, and there's been changes in how capitalism, to a certain extent, has defined itself over the last while, maybe moving from shareholder, in some cases, to a more stakeholder vision of capitalism, which, offer opportunities, I think, and then you have that changing regulatory environment too. And it'd be interesting to hear from you, Dominic, to end this first round, and maybe just to remind people that you can come in through the private chat on questions with questions for us as well, and we'll pick up a second round in a minute. But Dominic, I'd be interested in how you see the role that business and the private sector might play in establishing or building that social contract that we've been talking about, and maybe picking up relations between the state, business, employers and workers in your remarks. So over to you, Dominic.
Thank you, Rory. And, some fantastic comments and insights of what we should all be thinking long and hard about, and ultimately becoming actionable on and accountable for. We've seen in the UK, for example, that the state has become more involved in business than ever before. It's supporting millions of jobs. And at some point, businesses do need to pay back. The taxpayer needs to pay back, and entrepreneurs will have to step forwards to create new opportunities in the UK and, of course, other developing countries. But I am fearful of the role that business can play long-term without the continued support of government. Yet at the same time, this gives the government huge opportunity and all of the stakeholders to actually put down more concrete demands of how businesses should be acting. And we've seen in the UK, homelessness was eradicated overnight. We know that governments can make huge change. Unfortunately, it took a pandemic to take 30,000 people off the street in a G7 nation. So I think the public will be asking more and more questions, not just of civil society and its elected officials, but what can businesses do to make sure that they can have huge impact and change? My work is global. I operate in countries from Ethiopia, Ghana, through to Sri Lanka, Mexico, and have had the insights throughout this pandemic of the roles that businesses have been able to play or not play, and actually the roles of which governments have been able to play, and in certain instances not playing at all. We expect in certain countries or the developed world that PPE will turn up, that there is hand sanitization stations, and there are protocols in place. And I think we forget from afar, as the British public and others, that in Somaliland, it's not possible for PPE to just turn up, and isolation and quarantine facilities to be put in place, and testing facilities. The state is not able to provide that. Is business able to provide it? Potentially. So we have seen with the role of some of the NGOs stepping up and really engaging on state level to provide services or support to struggling governments in areas that they wouldn't necessarily be seen to do so, such as the Halo Trust, who are a demining charity, were in Somaliland working on the COVID response. And I think there's something to be said about how business can transition itself to actually support more in its unique examples. It's very difficult to manufacture garments in Ethiopia, but the garment manufacturers were probably the best place to support on PPE. My concerns really come now from the middle and lower income earners in the developed world will be driving down the cost of goods, the wages that we see in industries which are subject to abuse, such as the garment sector. People will no longer be necessarily caring about the price of their T-shirt or where it came from, or they'll certainly be looking to buy the cheapest T-shirt possible. So if we have the 3 million people that are furloughed in the UK, give or take, not be able to go back to work, that will have a ripple-on effect to the developing world. Because if people are eating in food banks in the UK, they're not going to be spending their money with the right businesses and retailers to ensure that supply chains are accurate and fair to the workforce that is providing and manufacturing those goods. So I think we're going to have to start asking and demanding more transparency on behalf of those that actually can't afford to make the difference and the change for their pocket. I often say that if you don't like a business, don't shop with them. But when you are unemployed and you are having to beg and borrow to feed your family, the last thing you're going to be thinking about growing up in Swansea is what's happening in Vietnam. So we have to, as businesses, shine the light on the issues, as organisations and governments need to be stepping up into that positions where its citizens aren't able to demand. It needs to demand of those companies that are providing to its citizens. And I would like to see a massive change in how investments are structured in the UK, not to massively confuse everyone, but there's a scheme here in London, or in Britain, called the Enterprise Investment Scheme, which allows investors to return 30%, get a tax relief on their income of 30% on the investments made. Now, the only criteria is that it's a qualifying trade. Where is the criteria that those businesses are paying fair wages to men and women? Or where is the criteria that those businesses are making sure that there is not forced labour in their supply chains? Where is the criteria that those businesses are not abusing and damaging the environment and societies that we all live and breathe and share for our prosperity? So there are easy fixes that we can be working on today to change it from an enterprise investment scheme to the ethical investment schemes. And these questions and demands, and I think we talked, it might have been Sharon had touched upon the mandating of central banks. I mean, I fully agree. Why should I be paying the same interest rate on borrowings whilst doing the right thing as a business? And there are businesses doing the wrong thing who are paying the same amount to play in the world of economies. So there's a number of changes that we can make to quickly shift business responsibility and mandate it, so that our governments in the developed world and the developing world can protect their citizens who might not have the power or the pound or the dollar to work with the ethical businesses to make sure that we can push the change far further along and quicker. And I would just like to talk about the vulnerable in business and how we've seen, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, the reliance on imports and how difficult it has actually been as well for intra-African trade. And we touched upon, some of the panelists have spoken about vulnerable workers in the informal sector. We know that the informal sector is the biggest driver of income for those in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly women. So unless we can get trade moving, unless we can get trade fair, unless we can keep trade safe, the vulnerable will become more vulnerable, the poor will become poorer, and it's going to become even more challenging and easier for those that wish to exploit to do so. So it's a ripple down effect. Despite the support that government is providing here in the developing world and the social contracts it has and the questions that are going to be asked post to make sure that those on the front line are better protected in the future, and we have a deep dive analysis in how to get it better and right next time, we are still faced with huge unemployment, which is going to ripple down to the developing world and cause further crisis and chaos for the vulnerable and for our planet and society. And these are the things that I want to start thinking about, and how we can make sure the government protects the citizens here in the UK and other developed worlds, which has the knock-on effect of making sure businesses are doing the right thing and protecting citizens in the developing world.
Well, thanks, Dominic. I mean, I think you raised for me some questions around, sort of interdependence and legitimacy too. I mean, if people are struggling in the Western world, how do we articulate a social contract which is inclusive? And I think that's a real challenge to opinion formers. And the questions you raise around maybe the state asking different questions of investors. I mean, I think perhaps there's also, some issues for us about learning from the lessons of the 2008, 2011 financial crisis and what happened and what didn't happen. And there's probably questions too that flow from that. Maybe this picks up the multilateral discussion a little bit previously around competing models. And if we are going to have a new kind of social contract on a global level, there are now different models of state organization and of capitalism, free market versus state capitalism, etc., where the relative attractiveness of those models is maybe evolving. And so the marketplace for ideas is maybe a bit more contested than maybe it was 20 years ago. And I think there are real questions for all of us who are engaged in these issues to reflect on as we go forward there. Some questions have come in, and I'm going to try, and we've about 15 minutes left, kind of go around to each of you and ask you to come in and address them. And I'll maybe put one question to each of you, and if we've any time at the end, I'll open it up for maybe some general comments. So Manoush, I mean, the recent political unrest in the US has come up, and it points, I think, to that absence of maybe a fully shared sense of common weal or division, which isn't unique to the US. I think we've all seen elements of it in our own countries. And if we are looking to a new social contract, I don't think we can presume that any of our countries has their recipe or the unique set of insights that help us move forward. Against that contract, are there any lessons that you think that the Western world or OECD countries could learn from what we call, but it's probably unfair, the less developed nations as we move to define a new social contract?
So I'd say I quite agree that this is a universal issue. The polarization of societies is a universal phenomenon. The need for a new social contract is universal. The reason it's universal is because the forces that are driving this are global. Why is our old social contract broken? Because women's economic roles have changed, and our old social contract was built on the assumption that women would take care of the young and the old, and women are working in the labor market, and so that's not so easy to do anymore. Second, technology has profoundly changed the nature of work. Third, aging is occurring everywhere. I mean, the only part of the world which isn't aging is Africa, and it will come. And fourth, we have climate change. And those four fundamental forces are affecting every country in the world and are the drivers behind the breakdown of our current social contracts. And having said that, I think the principles which should guide what our new contracts should look like are also universal. And they apply equally in advanced economies as developing countries. And those principles are, there should be a minimum below which no one should should go. And obviously that level of that minimum depends on how wealthy a country is, but I think we could all agree that there is a minimum. And second, that societies invest in people when they're young to maximize capability, and then expect capable adults to contribute back through taxes and their contributions to society. And we need a world in which there's maximum investment in capability and getting the most out of everyone. And that includes kids who are born in poor families, women, minorities, all of who have been not given the opportunity to contribute as much as they can because we haven't invested in their capabilities as much as we should. And then finally, I'd say we need a better way to manage risks. Our current systems in most societies have tilted the balance of risks onto individuals rather than society. And many of these risks, be they risks around health, not just pandemics, but general health, risks around unemployment, risks around old age, are better shared. And it's not because, I always say, this is not politically correct equality speak. This is about efficiency. It is much more efficient to manage health risks in a pooled large insurance pool than it is asking every individual to buy health insurance. That's why the US spends 17% of GDP on health and has one of the most inefficient and costly and poor outcome health systems in the world. Whereas you look at quite a few countries in the developing world or in Europe who are spending far less and getting much better health outcomes because they're pooling the risks efficiently. And so that issue of redefining how we manage risks collectively, I think is a general principle that applies equally in rich countries and poor countries.
Yeah, thanks, Manoush. And maybe we might kind of drill into taking it from there, maybe taking it down a level and just think, right, if that analysis is correct, I mean, maybe to Sharon and maybe also to Phil, I mean, combining a number of the questions, but, you know, if we are to support social cohesion, you know, where are the early entry points, considering where we are at the moment, you know, for policymakers to begin the redesign of the social contract? What kind of early interventions might we focus on? And maybe, you know, maybe specifically around, you know, racial equality, racial pay gap as well, which hasn't come up, but you know, it is one of those gaps, and it's one of those inequalities which we see in the Western world, but we see it on a global scale as well. So how do we address that too? So maybe the same question to both of you, maybe first to Sharon and then to Phil, if that's okay. Sharon, over to you.
Well, on the social front and about inclusion of women, it's investment in care, and Manoush is absolutely right about shared risk. It's a previous question. What do we want in our societies? Why do we make wealth if we're not prepared to share it? And in fact, what is it that we want for our children, our parents, our uncles, cousins, neighbours, whatever? And we have a very different approach in many of our countries, and I would argue Ireland, to that of the US. I don't want the US social model. I just don't want it in any country or for the world. If we aren't prepared to put a floor of care, and you've seen what happened with COVID on that front, unionised care homes were much safer than non-unionised, exploitative care homes for profit. And if we don't invest in health everywhere around the world, the sort of issues Dominic's raising, how on earth can you have stable workplaces and stable economies when we could have another health shock or we will have climate shocks and we'll have further economic shocks. When you go to people themselves, you know, if you're going to do something about racial and gender inequality, but generally about a floor of dignity, if you put in place a floor of rights, social protection, and minimum wages, with, of course, a right to bargain collectively above the minimum, but you have a floor with jobs, rights, and social protection, you give everybody a chance. But it does require us to reinvest in employment. We've just let the market decide. No government, you know, going back 30 years, ever gave up their role in trying to, you know, generate catalysts around employment. Look what's happening. So yes, it's a shared public and private area, but we cannot simply say one sector alone can get us out of this situation. And the final thing I'd say on this front is that if we are not serious about redistribution, if we're not, we already have seen an age of anger that is about income, it is about race or exclusion, it is about gender exclusion and harassment and so on. That age of anger will grow, and the divisions you see in our democracies now will become even worse, and no business can operate on that model. So it's in their interest to see that the current business model needs to shift. And Phil does lots of work around this. We work in partnership, and there's no doubt that there are businesses, I don't think it's public yet, but there's a major business who just decided to pay a minimum living wage across all of its sectors. That's leadership. The B4IG group supported mandated due diligence and analysing risk, putting the grievance in place, remedying exploitation and monitoring clean supply. They just supported 100% as a group of, 50 plus really decent businesses, the EU commitment to mandate due diligence. There is stuff going on, but can I tell you the division amongst business is creating an environment. And as much as we can all say, yes, stakeholder capitalism, what does it mean when you've still got people saying that it's as long as it doesn't affect the share price? I'm sorry, but we have $40 trillion of workers' capital. Our pensions invest in the global economy. I want the kind of values Dominic's talking about and shared risk and return, not the kind of winner takes all and the inequality we've got today.
No, thanks, Sharon. Same question to you, Phil. And I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to be about 2 minutes, if not more. So I'll bring Dominic in for 2 minutes at the end. Just the time is moving against us. Same question.
Yeah.
To you.
Thanks, and I can only agree already with what Manoush and Sharon has said, but also what Dominic was saying in his first set of remarks. I want to try and answer this to a degree through talking about that terrible word power, because the inequality is about inequality of income, inequality of wealth, but also inequality of power. And of course, from our experience in the Resource Centre, it's about inequality of power in markets. And it's for those reasons that we need to find the methods. I think some of what Dominic, particularly, and Sharon and Manoush have been talking about is finding the way to re-tilt the level playing field. I don't want it to be level anymore. It needs to be tilted towards the new social contract that's necessary. And so we need that new social contract, and it needs to start to address those issues of power. What would that involve? It involves, first of all, I think, real sense of the re-regulation, as I think Dominic was speaking about, particularly in terms of the investor world. The investor world is still very much unregulated in too many ways, particularly in the area, for instance, of green bonds. Anybody can call their stuff green investment. The European Union is starting to put those regulatory frameworks that will define what green actually means, so that I can invest with confidence in those bonds. Equally, I want the same for the social side of the ESG bargain. How do I know that the investments that I'm making are really going into companies that are paying a living wage, that are looking after the health and safety of their workers, etc. And equally, that are not stealing land. And I'll give you just one example. But, a good example of this is the renewable energy industry is in terrible danger at the moment of losing its social license to operate in many countries, because it is essentially colluding in the dispossession, particularly of indigenous people, of their land, because they get a very high return on investments by not paying for it. Now, contrast that with what's happening in Canada, where the indigenous people have got their title to their land and the subsoil, and there you've got a new model of co-ownership, where the indigenous nations are looking after those installations, but they're bringing the land to that deal, and the renewable energy companies are bringing the technology and the infrastructure. So it's those kind of efforts that are about re-tilting and rebalancing this extraordinary level of inequality that's built up in markets. And that has to be something that's fundamental. We need that example from Canada exported into Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, India, etc., and the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And so I think that those are things. Have I got another minute or another 10 seconds or not? Okay, just one last thing. One of the biggest issues is that, as Sharon was saying, there's an enormous division at the moment within business. There are some real leaders who are seeking to make this change happen, and there are a series of laggards that are involved in nefarious lobby and spending vast amounts of money on that lobby. You can see that if you read the FT over the last couple of days in terms of the expose of the amount of money that's gone into Trump and those who've denied the election results in the United States. They're now all saying, "Oh no, we'll not do it. We'll not do it for the next 3 months." Well, what does that mean? I'm just giving that as an example of why business has to come to this table with much more business has to come to the table with the kind of leadership that a small cluster of businesses and investors are showing. I'll shut up. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Phil. And I think that question of power and that framing around power is a really interesting one. And, it picks up that question around race, but not just race. I mean, it's gender, it's lots of other things. It's the economic power disparities around land rights, etc. A final question, and I'm sorry to put you under a little bit of time pressure, Dominic, but, what pro-business plan do you think, would be I suppose it's to us as civil servants or regulators, what kind of pro-business plan maybe, could we help you by putting in place to help redefine or address a new social contract? And, are there any visionary models that adopted by business which would help? Big question, short amount of time, but I leave it to your wisdom to navigate the time versus question.
Yeah, big question. Lots to be thought of. And I think the time has come, given that so much money has been put into businesses by governments of late due to the pandemic, that we need to put the carrot away and maybe get out the bat, quite frankly. Now, I'll give you an example. I'm not a fan, like many of you here, on the social state set up in the US. But when they brought in garment factories under the sanctions list for North Korea, you saw every sourcing director in America who said they're not buying from North Korea have a heart attack because they knew their factories in China were making their goods in North Korea. And that threat and that fear of going to jail ended the garment industry in North Korea overnight. Now, some would say that wasn't the right thing to do. We should have worked with the North Koreans to develop their garment sector. But actually, we can't work with the North Koreans to develop their garment sector. People there were being abused. Manufacturers who purportedly were making in China were taking advantage. And overnight, the US ended a forced labor garment scheme, despite every supplier saying they never bought from North Korea. So is it not time that we start to think about criminalizing forced labor, production and products that is ending up in shop floors, knowingly or not unknowingly? It's getting quite tiresome when an ESG assessment is done on a listed company, and as long as they have at least one sentence on modern day slavery, the box is ticked. We have companies that have 300 pages of policies on modern day slavery and are demonstrating and actioning those policies, who also get the same single tick. Where's the differentiator in that? And, in the UK, we have a very good law to protect against bribery and corruption. And if you knowingly or unknowingly are involved in corruption or bribery, directly, indirectly through a third party or an agent, it's a criminal offence. Why should the same not stand for forced labour in supply chains? If I knowingly or unknowingly, via a third party, indirectly or not directly, are purchasing product from factories where people are being exploited, that should be a criminal offence, quite frankly. So there is a lot to do to encourage, but it's come the time now where it is shocking that on British high streets, there is goods turning up in my house, your household, that people have been exploited to produce. So what is the business plan? Well, I think businesses are doing more generally. I think healthcare, Sharon touched on it. I'm a big fan of healthcare and making sure women are supported in the workforce, and particularly in the developing world where healthcare is a minimal. Work very close with people like at UNFPA, for example, and businesses will do that, and businesses will continue to do that, and we can encourage that. But where crimes against people are being committed, we have to make sure those crimes are acknowledged and punished in the right way at some point, because it's just going to continue. And North Korea ended overnight. I'm sure we could send the same fear down many directors' email chains to make the differences that they need to do. It's too little, too late, and COVID is the time to make that change and make a difference, because businesses are so reliant on the government at the moment. Just one glimpse of an idea. I've got many more.
Well, I think Dominic, I think what I've learned from today is we need more time to discuss this and really get underneath it. But I mean, I think, you know, thanks to you, thanks to Phil, Manoush, Sharon. I mean, I think it's been a really rich discussion. It's really hard to sum up, but I have a couple of key words because I'm conscious of time as well. But kind of things to take forward and explore further with concepts of power, you know, how we redefine risk, you know, what does inclusion mean? What does mutuality and assurance mean, I think, as well, if we're going to have a new social contract? Real questions about regulation, and I think global regulation or regional regulation and enforcement, you know, level playing fields and encouragement and inducements, I think are things that kind of came to mind to me. There's a lot more, and I'm not doing what you've said justice in reducing it to just those words. But I think it's been really rich, and I hope that the discussion continues based on you know, springboarding from today. So thank you for that, and I'd like to thank everyone for listening and for giving us some of the questions that we explored. And I'm going to hand it back now to Sarah to bring the conference to a close. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you very much to you, Sarah, and your team in ODI for organising the event and for your strong partnership. And much more than that, for the wellspring of ideas that you and ODI bring that help make things better for all of us. So thank you to everyone, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rory, for your kind words and for, you know, your brilliant moderation. But thanks to Manoush, Dominique, Phil, Sharon, I couldn't agree more with you, Rory. It really felt that we need more time. We were really getting to some pretty critical points in the conversation, which I'd really like to explore further. There is a lot to build, because the ideas that we were discussing at the end, it's what we need to act upon. And I would, you know, we've heard about the role of governments to try and make sure that, you know, we can shape this new social contract and take the opportunity of COVID. But I would add, you know, Sharon was also talking about the role of shareholders and the role of think tanks and academia and civil society at large to all try and really make sure that we don't miss this opportunity to reshape what we've been talking about for a long time, and now really present itself as a moment to finally act and bring these discussions to some concrete change. But let me hand over to my colleague, Francesca Bastaldi, our Director of Equity and Social Policy. A lot of your compliments go straight to Francesca, Rory, because she has been the engine of ideas and has really shaped today. Francesca is going to sum up the key conclusions from today, but we will then make sure that these conclusions come in a digital goodie bag that will be sent to all of you, both in terms of materials and, you know, sort of main points of conclusions, recommendations for action that you can then further work on. Francesca, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone. Thank you to all the participants that have contributed over the course of the day, the speakers, the chairs, the facilitators, and of course colleagues in ODI and at Irish Aid who have made this exchange possible. When we first met with ODI colleagues and Irish Aid to discuss this conference, the idea really was to promote a conversation and an exchange on what we feel is one of the most, if not the most pressing issues of our times, which is tackling inequality. And all of this in a context of an ongoing global health and economic crisis. So I hope you have found the event interesting and stimulating. I can speak for myself. It certainly has been very thought-provoking and given me a lot of food for thought and ideas that we will be taking forward. And I'll come back to it in a minute. Before we do, just a few top line key messages that have come through over the course of this exchange. The first is around the question of inequalities exposed, and a real concern that the current ongoing crisis does risk exacerbating inequalities further if we do not take action, and if we don't do so with some urgencies. So it was clear that the coronavirus and the wider crisis has exposed inequalities, making them more visible to society. It is also contributing to strengthening them. And while we heard of the need to continue to monitor and analyze the role that the pandemic and the containment measures and other policy measures are having in influencing trends in inequality. The sense is the available evidence today is pointing very clearly and markedly at how the crisis is disproportionately negatively affecting particular population groups and also, of course, particular countries. But there's a clear and growing body of evidence on how the negative adverse effects are vary depending on across features such as we've said and heard throughout this exchange, varying by age, gender, race, and so on. So there's a growing body of evidence and a lot of work to be done still on monitoring all this and analyzing it. This came, I think, across strongly in the first session and some of the breakout sessions where we do need more data and more evidence on these issues. Why does this all matter? I think there's a clear, what came across also quite strongly, an intrinsic value in this, and a very sincere concern in terms of justice and fairness came across very strongly throughout. But also from a very most practical perspective, there's a clear recognition that's arising from this ongoing crisis, but also from past crises. If we think back to 2008, but also 97, that those countries that have that a country's ability to respond to a crisis and how it manages crisis response largely depends on pre-existing inequalities and the systems in place before the crisis hits. So if there is concern, as we do have, for preparedness and response to future crises moving forward, then concerns about equity need to be a priority as we respond to the crisis now and as we move forward towards recovery. The second core theme of the day of this half-day event was the role of social protection and tax and wider fiscal policy. And here, a key emerging consideration is that in some ways the gaps and shortcomings that the current crisis has exposed both across social protection and tax policy are not new. So here too, for many of us that have been working in this field for a long time, these are issues that we have been denouncing and working to address over a long time. What the crisis has done and is doing as we speak is that it's re-emphasizing the urgency that something be done about it. And we've had a lot of learning and sharing again evidence and information on what works, whether on the side of the social protection and more broadly social policy sort of spending side of things, and across the tax domain, where there are, what are some of the priority action points that can be adopted moving forward, and where there are opportunities precisely arising from the crisis and the growing demand for reform that is coming both in the field of social protection and around taxation, which among other things may help to tackle some of the issues around political will and promoting and supporting opportunities for taking forward reforms that otherwise that will require some additional political effort and may encounter resistance by some vested interests. But without going into details, because I can get carried away, but we don't want to go into details about the specifics of what we've learned across these policy domains, there are some, key cross-cutting themes emerging here. A key message is that we need to look at systems as a whole. Sure, important to look at some of the nitty-gritty and some of also the positive, I think, developments we are seeing in some policy sectors in response to the crisis. But ultimately, we need to look at the two sides of the coin. So at how both social protection and social policy more widely and taxation interact. It's the way the system works as a whole that matters to people's outcomes, people's the distribution of income, wealth, but either wider sort of development outcomes. But it matters hugely also to the sustainability of the system, financially, politically, and critically to how it sustains or the sort of social contract it establishes. And this was brought up also very clearly in the concluding session. A second key related point that is cross-cutting is that we need to adopt a life cycle approach. Too often we're still looking, when we consider about these policy, some of the policy gaps, inequities, and also what to be done about them in terms of static terms. Who's benefiting from particular adjustments or policies, who's paying in. This reinforces a sense of a false sense of them and us, of those that are benefiting and those that aren't. The truth is we're all in this together. This is coming across, again, very clearly as a result of this crisis. And we can do better as we think through what the policy adjustments and reforms need to look like, both in the immediate response, as we are in the crisis still, but also as we move forward. There's a risk otherwise that we continue to perpetuate this perception of a fracture between across society, and this in turn leads to fractured, ineffective systems and policies that generally will lead to, at most, a minimal sort of last resort safety net that frankly is inadequate. And we're seeing this, even just over the course of the last few days on the question of school feeding and the food parcels that are being sent out to replace school feeding for children in low income households. So I think the third overarching point is one of time frame. Another issue that the crisis does push is that some responses may be quite short-sighted, and this is partly understandable. Of course, in the case of a crisis of this kind, there is an urgency of responding with immediacy, of stepping up or adjusting policies as required in a timely fashion and to a large enough scale to reach the high number of people affected, which is all very well. But if we really want to make a difference this time around, we do need to be thinking medium to long term, and how do the adjustments or reforms that are being undertaken in the immediate instance, what are the implications for the medium long term, and the potential to address all the gaps, the inconsistencies, the inequities that we have been talking about over the course of this conference, to rebuild into something different and then really talk about a global reset. And this leads me to the third big strand of today, which is the social contract. Here too, calls for a new social contract, as the panel very eloquently said, are not new, and they were already underway, and the momentum around these were growing as a result of trends, pre-pandemic trends in rising within country inequalities, changes in the world of work, of course, climate, demographic changes that were revealing cracks in the system and in the social contract, which meant that it needs to be renewed, it needs to be reset. And the crisis has reinforced these calls. We know that crises can act as an opportunity for change, and we've heard that again throughout, including in this final panel where we heard, I think, very interesting and concrete options of how we can redesign or reestablish a social contract that needs to do better in terms of how we manage risk, and also reverse some of the trends we've seen pre-pandemic, but that partly risk being reinforced by the pandemic, where risk is increasingly individualized and away from more collective risk sharing. So a need to reconsider and rethink what that means, how we share risk, how we pool risk, how we manage things and risk collectively. The question of the re-regulation or regulation of investments and bringing in all actors across the board, including, of course, governments, the employers, the business and private interests, as well as workers, and as Sara mentioned, people such as ourselves, including researchers, think tanks, and so on, that need to be involved in this process. I think, I mean, just really to come towards the conclusion, I'm mindful of time, that I think the message is key, that there is an opportunity here to bring about significant and systemic change. We also know that the pressure is mounting on from various fronts, and we heard this again also in the final session. As the economic crisis deepens, we face greater job losses, move towards recessions, the pressures on the fiscal space. There will be pressures for moving towards austerity. And in the past, if we look at, again, to past crises, even those that were followed by initial expansionary and even progressive reform, were eventually followed by, in many cases, very severe cuts to public spending and tax cuts that tended to benefit the better off, with a very high price paid by those that were worse off, de facto exacerbating inequalities and contributing to the further withering away of the social contract. So the conclusive message is, if this time around things are going to be different, then we really have to make an effort to make sure that equity considerations are at the front and the center of the response efforts in the sort of short, immediate term, but also as we recover and rebuild moving forward. So where do we go from here? As Rory said in the last session, we really need more time to discuss, as if we've just scratched the surface, just started the conversation within this group of participants, and that's something we will do in a number of ways. In the immediate instance, a concrete thing, ODI will be putting online the several resources we will be sharing with you, as Sara says, a goodie bag. So for those of you who either missed part of the event or want to relive it, this will be a possibility. The plenary sessions, but also Jamboard comments and so on, will be placed online. We will also be continuing right away to discuss and provide a venue for discussion on these topics with a new event and the launch of a new report on Leave No One Behind, and again, tackling inequality, which will be launched on January 21st, so just next week, and we hope you will join us again then. But more broadly, many of the issues that we touched upon today are at the heart of a range of initiatives, including research and advisory work that the ODI is carrying out together with colleagues that have joined today. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in the days and months to come.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And just to emphasize and reiterate, our commitment to ODI to really make conversations around inequality and thinking how we turn that into action at the heart of our work for this year and beyond. But all is left for me to do is really to thank all of you for attending today, and particularly those who have stuck with us to the end. We know that digital fatigue is real, and particularly in the current context, being online for 4 hours in a conference is quite a lot. This wraps up our conferences under the ODI 60 banner, but it's not the end of the story. We will be launching our conclusions and recommendations from the Global Reset dialogue that we've been leading the whole year in March. So if you're interested, if you want to hear more, follow us on our social media channels or sign up our newsletter on odi.org. There should be a link in the chat as well. And with that, let me thank IrishAid once again, and a very warm farewell to you all. Stay safe and see you soon.